In the summer of 1901, a federal land agent named Samuel Joseph Holsinger rode into Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico to investigate a homestead claim. He stayed for weeks and produced an 80-page report with more than 100 photographs. Buried in it, between notes on sandstone dams and irrigation ditches, he described something odd. Above the great house, called Chetro Kettle, cut into the cliff face, were staircases. Leading away from them across the open mesa were faint, dead straight lines in the desert. Holsinger called them roads. He had no idea how far they went. 80 years later, survey crews from the Bureau of Land Management followed one of those lines north out of the canyon. It ran roughly 31 miles, holding true north to within half a degree for one long stretch. It was 30 feet wide, built by people with no wheeled vehicles and no draft animals. But then it stopped, at the crumbling edge of a badlands canyon in front of nothing at all. So who was that road built for? Why is it wider than a modern two-lane highway? And why do the Pueblo Nations, speaking about roads like this one, not describe them as roads at all? The deeper you follow this one, the stranger it gets. To make sense of it, we have to start where the evidence starts. That means the ground itself and the string of visitors who kept finding lines cut into it long before anyone thought to ask what the lines were for. The first was William Henry Jackson. In May of 1877, he came through Chaco Canyon with the Hayden Survey, the federal expedition mapping the American West. Jackson was one of the great photographers of his generation, the man whose pictures of Yellowstone helped make it the first national park. At Chaco, his photography failed. What survives from that visit is a drawing, and in it is a set of steps hacked into the sandstone wall north of Chetro Kettle, climbing toward the rim. We still call it the Jackson Staircase. It is the best preserved example of its kind in the canyon, and it does not lead to a dwelling. It leads up onto the empty mesa. Then came the airplane. In 1929, Charles and Anne Morrow Lindbergh flew over the Southwest and photographed archaeological sites from the air, and more than 100 of those frames covered the Chaco country. From 5,000 feet, things invisible on the ground start to show themselves, faint, linear shadows. Vegetation growing in strange, straight bands across the sagebrush. Archaeologists went back to that aerial imagery for decades afterward. By the 1970s, the National Park Service had a remote sensing unit working on Chaco specifically. And by the early 1980s, the Bureau of Land Management had launched the Chaco Roads Project, driven by proposals to mine coal across the San Juan Basin. The Phase 1 report, edited by Chris Kincaid and published in 1983, is still the foundation document for everything we know about these features. Here is what it found. The well-defined roads near the major great houses average about 30 feet across, wider than a two-lane road in an American town today and far wider than any other ancient trail in the Southwest. Where a road met a cliff, the builders did not go around. They cut stairways into the living sandstone or built them out of masonry and fill. They raised earthen ramps and they laid low masonry curbs along the edges. In places, they cut long grooves into bare bedrock, apparently just to mark where the road was supposed to be, and the longest of them all runs north. 2 separate stairway routes climb out of the canyon from Pueblo Bonito and Chetro Kettle, the 2 largest buildings in the region, and converge at a great house called Pueblo Alto on the north rim. From there, the road angles 13 degrees east of north for 2 miles to Escovado Wash. Then it swings onto true north and holds that bearing within half a degree for the next 10 miles until it reaches a strange cluster of small buildings perched on knobs and pinnacles called Pierre's Complex. Then it shifts 2 degrees and runs rigidly straight for another 19 miles. It ends at Cuts Canyon, not at a town, not at a river crossing. It ends at a mound on the lip of an eroded badlands escarpment, where a stairway once descended a slope so steep it is nearly impassable. The Solstice Project relocated that stairway in the 1980s. It had been built as a series of earth-packed platforms held up by juniper posts and crossbeams, and it was already collapsing. Someone engineered a staircase down the side of a badlands canyon in the middle of an empty basin for a road that carried no wheels. If you enjoy documentaries built out of original survey reports, archaeology, and the traditions of the people who are still here, consider subscribing. Because the emptiness at the end of that road turns out to be the second strangest thing about it. The strangest thing is that in places there is more than one of it. For a good part of its length north of Pierre's Complex, the Great North Road is not a road. It is 2 roads, running side by side, close together, both engineered, both maintained. And at one location, aerial imagery flown by the Bureau of Land Management in 1981 shows 4 of them. 4 almost perfectly parallel roadbeds, spaced less than 140 feet apart, running together for about a mile through open sagebrush country where there is nothing to avoid and nothing to divide around. This is a society with no carts, no oxen, and no horses. Every pound of timber, corn, water, and turquoise that ever moved across the San Juan Basin moved on somebody's back. And they built 4 parallel highways over an empty plain, each one wide enough for a modern truck. Where the parallel pairs have been examined closely, one of the two usually shows noticeably more wear than its partner. One was walked. The other, apparently, was not. Then there's the question of what people left behind on the road, and the answer is almost nothing. Across its full length, surveyors found no hearths, almost no chipped stone, and no sign that anyone ever camped, which is a peculiar thing to be able to say about a 30-mile route through waterless country. What they did find was broken pottery, and it is broken in the wrong pattern. Ordinary sites in the canyon produce a mix of cooking ware and serving bowls. The North Road produces an unusual concentration of jars and decorated non-utility ceramics. Dense, elongated scatters of sherds lie along the roadbed in stretches with no structures nearby, and no sign anyone stopped to rest. And there's a concentration of them at the top of the collapsed Cuts Canyon stairway. Only about 1/10 of that pottery came from the big San Juan River communities to the north, which is thin evidence for a trade route. In 1989, Anna Sofair of the Solstice Project, the archaeologist Michael Marshall, and the physicist Rolf Sinclair published their analysis of the Great North Road in a Cambridge University Press volume called World Archaeoastronomy. Their summary of it is hard to improve on. The road, they wrote, is overbuilt and underused. It goes nowhere, and the effort spent on it is wildly out of proportion to any benefit anyone could have gotten from it. In many important respects, they concluded, the road appears to be its own reason for existing, which sounds like a mystery. Before we treat it as one, the case against it deserves a fair hearing, because it is stronger than most documentaries admit. Start with the maps. The archaeologist John Cantner has pointed out that a great many of the alignments first spotted from the air turned out, on the ground, to be historic wagon and ranch roads. Portions of what was once confidently called the Southeast Road are exactly that. Once you accept that, the whole practice of connecting scattered segments into grand continental arteries starts to look reckless. Cantner calls the connect the dots approach dangerous, and he is right. The verification record is thinner still. 9 long-distance Chaconne roads have been proposed over the years. According to the archaeologist Gwyn Vivian, only 2 of those 9 have been even partially confirmed by combined aerial and groundwork. The Southeast Road and the Mexican Springs Road could not be verified at all, despite intensive ground survey. Most of what remains, everywhere else in the region, is short segments running a mile or 2 out of a great house and then simply stopping. And the famous straightness deserves scrutiny too. Fred Niles, who wrote the technical description of road construction for the 1983 Phase 1 report, noted that reportedly, straight roads actually consist of a series of roughly aligned straight segments joined by abrupt doglegs. He added something even more deflating. Some of our sense of these perfect lines comes from the straight lines archaeologists themselves drew on maps, labeled as projected alignments, in the many places where no actual roadway could be found on the ground. Part of the mystery of Chaco's roads to nowhere, in other words, is a mystery about cartography. There are also ordinary explanations on the table for the parts that are real. Chaco's great houses swallowed enormous quantities of construction timber hauled in from mountain ranges 50 miles and more away, and a cleared, level 30-foot corridor is a useful thing to have when a crew is carrying a roof beam. Several short segments run from a great house directly to a spring, and jar-heavy pottery is exactly what you would expect from people carrying water. Thomas Windes, who studied the road network around Pueblo Alto, concluded that most of the ceramic breakage along the canyon roads came from hauling jars. So it is entirely possible that the Chacones built wide roads for boring reasons, that erosion and overinterpretation did the rest, and that a federal report from 1983 accidentally created a legend. It is also possible that the descendants of the people who built them have been telling us what the roads were for the entire time, and that almost nobody was listening. The Pueblo Nations are not a historical footnote to Chaco. They are its continuation. The 20 pueblos of the All-Pueblo Council of Governors, from Zuni in western New Mexico to the villages along the Rio Grande, along with the Hopi in Arizona, trace their ancestry directly to the people who built the great houses. Clans named Chaco in their migration histories. Pilgrimages are still made there. To the Hopi, sites like this one were never abandoned. They are footprints, evidence of where the clans walked, and they remain living places. And in Pueblo tradition, a road is an extraordinarily loaded thing. The Tewa word for road, as the Tewa anthropologist Alfonso Ortiz of Okai Owenge once explained to the Solstice Project team, translates as a channel for the life's breath. In her 1939 study, Pueblo Indian Religion, Elsie Clues Parsons recorded that important spirits are keepers of the roads, and that a road of cornmeal or pollen gets sprinkled on the ground for any spirit whose presence is requested. A road, in that sense, is something you make in the moment, and you make it so that someone can arrive. Where do those roads go? For the Carasan Pueblos, the place of emergence, the Shipapu, lies to the north, and that is where Eyataku, the mother of all, remains. Leslie White's account of Karasan cosmology describes people who came up out of the worlds below, stayed near the opening because it was too sacred to live beside, and were told to travel south. When they died, their souls went back north. Every year, the souls of the dead returned to visit their relatives and eat food left for them on their graves and on the road to the north. In 1894, in her report on Zia Pueblo for the Bureau of American Ethnology, Matilda Cox Stevenson described that same road to the Shipapu as crowded. Crowded with spirits going down to the lower world, and with the spirits of unborn infants coming up out of it. She recorded more than once that such roads are straight. Now hold that next to the archaeology carefully. At Santa Ana Pueblo, Leslie White documented a funeral practice in which a vessel holding the last meal of the dead is killed, broken deliberately at the rim, and thrown out to the north, in the direction the soul travels. On the Great North Road, archaeologists find jars, broken, in dense scatters, in empty stretches where nobody camped. In his 1969 book, The Tewa World, Alfonso Ortiz described the Tewa term for the course of a life. It means path. It begins as one path for all people, then divides into two parallel paths that run side by side until the end of life, when they rejoin and become one again. On the Great North Road, for mile after mile, there are two parallel roadbeds. And in the Zuni emergence prayers recorded by Ruth Bunzel in 1932, the people describe traveling toward Itawana, the middle place, and seeing four roads going side by side. North of Pierre's complex, in aerial photographs from 1981, there are four roads going side by side. None of that proves anything, and it is important to say so plainly. Traditions written down in the 1890s and the 1930s cannot be assumed to reproduce what people believed in the year 1100. Much of that early ethnography was collected by outsiders, sometimes over the objections of the communities involved, and Pueblo people today are not obliged to explain any of it. Some knowledge is simply not for publication, and that restraint carries meaning of its own. But the obvious objection cuts the other way too. Why should traditions recorded 800 years later tell us anything about Chaco at all? Because these are not unrelated peoples. The migration is documented in the archaeology, in the pottery, in the architecture, and in the oral histories of the Pueblos themselves, all pointing the same direction. Continuity is the default assumption here, not the extraordinary claim, and Pueblo scholars have been reframing the whole question. Philip Tewa, a Hopi geodesist who has worked on Chaco for years, suggests we have the direction backwards. A road, he says, is not coming out of the Great House. It is going into the Great House and anchoring that Great House in spiritual space. Read that way. The road never failed to arrive anywhere. Arriving was never what it was for. So here's where things actually stand. Nobody disputes that the roads exist. Nobody disputes that they were deliberately engineered, that the major ones run about 30 feet wide, that stairways were cut through solid sandstone to keep them straight, or that most of them were built after about the year 1050 and had fallen out of use by around 1150. Nobody serious disputes that the Pueblo Nations descend from the people who built them. The questions begin almost immediately after that. Whether any single road ever ran continuously for its full projected length. Whether the northern bearing is astronomical or topographic, or both. Whether the parallel pairs are two roads or one idea. And whether road is even the right English word for the thing we are looking at. The evidence keeps arriving. In January of 2025, the journal Antiquity published work by Robert Weiner, Richard Friedman, and John Stein at a place called the Gasco site in the Red Mesa Valley about 50 miles south of Chaco. Using public LiDAR data, laser mapping that strips vegetation off the terrain, they found that a road segment thought to be a few hundred feet long actually runs nearly 4 miles. They also found a second road nobody knew existed, running parallel to the first about 115 feet away. Both line up with the winter solstice sunrise over Mount Taylor, a mountain that remains sacred to Pueblo and Navajo people today. Walk that country now, and you can still find these things. On the Pueblo Alto Trail, you cross a segment of the Great North Road, where a sign marks the cleared path through a rock-strewn sandstone face. On the South Mesa Trail, you walk a piece of the South Road back from the Great House at Sincletzen. At the northern end, near Twin Angels Pueblo above Coots Canyon, the view takes in gas wells and a facility where contaminated soil is plowed into the ground, and the old stairway into the canyon has largely been carried off by looters. That landscape is being argued over right now. The 20 pueblos of the All Pueblo Council of Governors are asking Congress to permanently protect a 10-mile buffer around the park, land withdrawn from new mineral leasing for 20 years in 2023 and currently under federal review. Navajo Nation leadership and Navajo allotment holders inside that buffer have taken a different position, arguing the restriction harms families who depend on that income. There's no version of this story where the roads simply sit undisturbed in the desert. History is rarely settled by one discovery. It gets assembled, A survey report at a time, a photograph at a time, a laser scan at a time, and occasionally a whole generation looks at what the previous generation collected and realizes the question was framed wrong from the beginning. The roads are real. The width is real. The straightness is real. What none of that tells us is what a road meant to the people who cut those stairways into the cliff above Chetro Kettle, hauled juniper posts down into a badlands canyon, and then walked north across an empty basin on a highway 30 feet wide, carrying jars they intended to break. Maybe they were moving timber. Maybe they were moving something else. Thanks for spending this time in the San Juan Basin. If you want more forgotten federal reports, strange landscapes, and the traditions of the nations who are still here, subscribe and stick around. And I would like to know what you make of it. If those 4 parallel roadbeds north of Pierre's complex are not engineering, what are they? And if a road can be built to be looked at rather than walked, how much else out in that basin have we been measuring with the wrong instrument entirely?